name of God, most gracious, most merciful, thank you for attending this special Sunday program of the Islamic Center of Southern California. And we have a lot to offer today in terms of the issue of Palestine and the assault on Gaza. And more importantly for us, what we can do as Americans, as American Muslims in this situation. And for many people, this has been a struggle and a frustration on so many fronts. You have, interestingly, one of the strangest relationships between the United States government and the government of Israel, in that you have some apparent differences between the Obama administration and the Netanyahu administration, to the point that the Netanyahu administration will spy on the Secretary of State. And there's some personal differences according to reports. However, the US government, including Obama himself, stands solidly behind Israel's actions, and even to the point where President Obama made it a declaration at a Ramadan iftar with a group of 80 American Muslims that he had to make the point about Israel. And the enormity of that alone is something that deserves further discussion, but not today, but just understanding the enormity of that situation. And Netanyahu has, on so many occasions, when he has differences with the Obama administration, he goes to the Congress. The first time he did that actually is when President Obama made a declaration of the need to end settlements and to bridge understanding with the Muslim world. Apparently, Netanyahu was not happy with that, so he came to the Congress to give a counter-argument to the president and got 27 rounds of applause by the US Congress. That does not happen with any country. It doesn't happen with the United Kingdom, doesn't happen with France, doesn't happen with Germany, doesn't happen with any ally. So it's a very strange relationship, let's just put it that way. Then on the religious arena, you have many interfaith groups that are for peace and justice, but are paralyzed on the situation, or when they want to act on the situation, they are lobbied against. And only recently, I believe it's the Presbyterian Church, Sherna knows more than most of us about this issue. She'll be speaking a little bit about the boycott, divestment, sanctions issue later. But the Presbyterian Church finally passed a resolution for divestments of any of their accounts, their funds, the businesses they do for retirement from any businesses that have investments in Israel. And it barely passed, but it's an annual issue, and it's going to continue. The Episcopalians tried, I believe, but they were thwarted from that attempt. And within the peace and justice interfaith community, unfortunately, there tends to be a moral equivalence between what's happening to the Palestinians and what's happening to Israelis in terms of this latest conflict, this assault, massacre. And so there's a lot to be done along the interfaith front. In terms of news media and entertainment media, let me just say in entertainment media there were two celebrities, Penelope Cruz and some other guy whose name I don't know. Javier Bardem. Thank you. And these are my Hollywood experts too. So they came out in support of Palestine, and immediately John Voight, who is very much pro-Israel, very much to the right on the issue, came out and slammed them in one of the Hollywood journals. And then I read a report today that Penelope Cruz and Javier Bardem are being banned from performing in certain studios now. And then news media itself, very rarely do you get a glimpse or a balanced debate. And I think we all agree, many of us in this room know too well, there is no debate on this issue, that the American people can really see different sides of the issue. There's a lot of name-calling, blacklisting, and downright intimidation and fear for anybody who speaks for the Palestinian issue. So this is an American issue. It's as much an American issue as it is a foreign policy issue. And it's an American issue for two main reasons. Number one, the conflict in terms of dealing with Palestine and Palestinian statehood and Palestinian equality and dignity and human rights and freedom will define the United States in this century. It will define the United States in terms of its foreign policy. If it continues to turn a blind eye to the atrocities against the Palestinians, it doesn't matter really how much it tries to deal with the rest of the Muslim world or in any other region for that matter, because this is the one time the United States has the ability to do something about it, and it has chosen not to. So it is a defining moment for the United States in terms of its image and its identity in the 21st century. And I do recall we had a forum that Dr. Hatu spoke at 20 years ago in the center when Bernard Lewis came out with this line that the major dangers of the 20th century are Nazism, communism, and radical Islamic fundamentalism. And very few people understood what that was about, but it turns out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy that from the actions of the United States, there has grown, and this requires more analysis and more history in terms of its relations with the Gulf, its actions in Iraq, its treatments of the people of Iran, especially in 1952, and so on and so forth. It has, in many ways, has fueled the flame of anti-Americanism and given more to this notion of radical Islamic fundamentalism as a reality that we all have to deal with now. That's not to say that we as Muslims don't have a responsibility ourselves in dealing with what the Islamic narrative is and should be. That's an internal struggle we have. And even Dr. Fethi Osman said 60 years ago, our major struggle is this problem of Muslim extremism. But to exploit it politically and militarily and then create more enemies for the United States, I think that in and of itself deserves some further analysis. And then the last thing, in terms of why it's important for America, I think to many Americans who are not aware of the situation, their tax dollars, their credibility, the political weight of the United States in the international community has been used to block any kind of redress of grievances and bringing to justice the situation. So we have two scholars with us today that are going to give us more insight on this, the issue of Palestine. The first I'm going to introduce is Gabriel Peterberg. He's the director of the von Grunebaum Center at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. He's in the Department of History at UCLA as a professor. Gabriel Peterberg was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and grew up in Israel. He graduated at Tel Aviv University, where he majored in Middle East history and political science for his bachelor's in arts, and Middle East and European history for his master's in arts. His degree in philosophy, his PhD, was in the history of the Ottoman Empire from the University of Oxford. He taught at the University of Durham, England, and Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. And Professor Peterberg writes and teaches on the history of the Ottoman Empire and the Mediterranean in the early modern period, and modern themes like colonialism, Zionism, and Palestine, Israel. He writes for the New Left Review and the London Review of Books. We're very honored that he has made time to be with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Gabriel Peterberg.
Assalamu alaikum, ya Jama'at al-Khair. Many thanks for inviting me, Salam, and to you for having me and listening to what I have to say. I don't want to give the sort of usual expertology talk on the Gaza situation, although I'll refer to it, but I'll do what I can do, which is I'm a historian, so put this in larger perspective and give it some historical depth. So what I want to talk about is colonialism, settler colonialism in Palestine. So from the 16th century on, there emerged two kinds of colonialism: European colonialism and later on American and perhaps other entities outside of Europe. But in the world, globally, one was colonialism, in which European states conquered territories outside of Europe, exploited them, ruled the indigenous people, and extracted from it as much as they could, economically and strategically, and several other domains. The other type, which is perhaps less known and less understood for sure, is settler colonialism, in which the conquest of certain territories outside of Europe was accompanied by waves of immigration of settlers from Europe. Britain is the outstanding locale, but there are other places. And gradually, they tried to carve for themselves national patrimonies in these geographies and create nation states in the European mold, which they ruled, and in which the indigenous people faced, in my view, a much greater danger than straightforward colonialism posed to them. Now, the Middle East has faced both. First of all, it was for the modern Middle East, I should say. In the wake of the demise of the Ottoman Empire, it faced, first of all, colonial expansion that basically carved up the Middle East into its own convenience and created what we now know as the modern Middle East. And especially the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement between the two foreign ministers of Britain and France created states that were, I would call them, unnatural, in the sense that they had never existed before as such. Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, and in a different way Jordan, which was not the result of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but is part of these arrangements after the First World War, were all created as a result of colonial arrangements. And it's no wonder that as states, they are the most unstable states in the Middle East. Lebanon, Syria is falling apart, Iraq is falling apart, Jordan, who knows? And Israel, Palestine is itself unstable for a different reason, in a different way. And we have to remember that these countries are the making of a colonial greed that carved up the Middle East according to colonial desires and conveniences. No country of those I mentioned, except for Egypt, which is a different case, it's a more natural geography, never existed as such under Ottoman rule. It's clearly a colonial design. But to this colonial design, what we call metropole colonialism, we have to add two cases of settler colonialism with grave consequences for the people of the region. One was French Algeria, which was conquered in 1830, but beginning in 1848, more and more waves of immigrants, not only from France, from Malta, from the south of Italy and Spain, came to create this community of settlers we now know as Pieds Noirs. And they created a strange, or no, I shouldn't say strange, complicated relationship with the French colonial center. And in 1962, it fell apart as a result of the Algerian War of Independence, its successful victory and Algerian independence. And the settlers packed up and went back mostly to France, although they were not all ethnically French. The other case is Israel-Palestine, which was created by Britain, and I won't go over the whole history, which is quite complicated with all sorts of letters and agreements and so on and so forth, because simply I don't have the time. It's a very interesting episode, but I don't have the time. But what was created there under the umbrella of British bayonets is a settler colonial project called Zionism, or the Zionist colonization of Palestine. Zionism was not created in Palestine, but that's its main outcome, obviously. It has to be clearly understood that although colonialism and settler colonialism are not the same analytically and also historically, there is a certain relationship between metropole colonial centers and settler projects. And settler projects are impossible without the initial support and cover of the imperial power. The Zionist project in its first, say, 30 to 40 years, from 1882, I would say, to the Great Arab Rebellion of 1936 to 39, would not have survived without British support, endorsement, and protection, basically. The Great Arab Revolt would have removed the Zionist project, such as it was at that period, if it wasn't for the British who suppressed it and basically broke the back of Palestinian society. When Palestinian society came to the 1948 war and the Nakba, it had already been decimated by the British in 1936-39. And that's one, it's not the only reason, but one of the main reasons why the Zionists won that war. Now, what has to be borne in mind, and that is relevant to what is happening now, I don't want to bother and bore you with too deep an analysis of settler colonialism, but basically, really, there are two types of settler colonies. One, you can call it a plantation colony, on which the economy doesn't have to be, strictly speaking, plantation in the narrow sense of the word, but its main characteristic is that it requires indigenous labor from the point of view of the settlers. That means that the natives, quote unquote, are necessary to the social economic formation. In South Africa, in French Algeria, the economy would not function without the exploitation of native labor. The Zionist case is, in my view, more dangerous from the perspective of the indigenous people, because it is what we call pure settlement colony, like the north of the United States 200-300 years before it, and the Australian case, to cite two outstanding examples, in which native labor, to call a spade, native labor is not required. It's not only not required, it's ideologically rejected. That makes the indigenous people, from the standpoint of the settlers, not objectively, I'm emphasizing this, basically superfluous, because they are not needed for the social economic structure that the settlers have the power to create. This fact, the fact that they are superfluous to the social economic structure, makes the end result of these cases either an elimination or an attempt to eliminate. What bothers the Israeli Jews, I should say, viscerally about the Palestinians is not their alleged terror, nor their cultural differences, nor anything of the sort. It's their mere presence. When settlers want the land but not the labor, what bothers them is the presence of the natives, not any other thing. All the rest is excuses or face-saving from ideological embarrassments. And in my view, that's what has been going on in Palestine and later Palestine, Israel, from 1882. There was a period from 1882 to 1904, 1905, in which the economy was one of plantations, of ethnic plantations, in which cheap indigenous labor was required. But from 1904, more or less, what came to dominate the Zionist project ideologically, not only on the ground, was what I earlier called pure settlement colony. And native labor was eschewed. It was not wanted. Not only they did not require it, they ideologically didn't want it. Since then, the unique settler situation in Palestine is that, unlike previous cases of settler colonialism of that kind, like in the northern US initially and then in the US in general, in Australia, for a variety of reasons I won't go into, but also the discrepancy of time, they could not eliminate the local population. They could not get rid of it completely as they had done here and as they had done in Australia. The end result of, to make a long story short, of course, it's a bit more complex than that, is that the asymmetry of power and success between the settlers and the indigenous people has kept growing. With time, the settlers and their state, Israel, has become much more powerful in every aspect you want to think of. But at the same time, they have been unable to eliminate the native or the indigenous people, and especially their presence in terms of sovereignty. In other words, here and in Australia, there may be a few Indians, there may be a few Aboriginals. I'm not belittling them, of course, but they are not consequential in terms of demand for sovereignty. In Palestine, they are. Now, from the perspective of the Israelis, I should say the Israeli Zionists, which is, of course, the vast majority, the problem is that their power keeps growing, the asymmetry of power keeps growing, but they can't really fulfill it because, for a variety of reasons, they can't get rid of the indigenous people. This results in what the late Israeli sociologist, a very good one, Baruch Gimmerling, has called politicide. In other words, in place of actually eliminating the indigenous population, or at least ethnically cleansing them, which is physically removing them, like the Nakba in 48, the Israeli long-term strategy is to make the Palestinians so defeated, so weakened, and so especially fragmented, that they are no longer a viable political collective body. They are fragmented and separated into different regions, small enclaves, increasingly among which there's no connection at all. And in that way, they perhaps don't eliminate the Palestinians physically, nor ethnically cleanse them. It's ongoing, but it's not large numbers enough to make any real transformation. But in that way, they eliminate them as a politically viable community that can lay claim to Palestine. This is ongoing, and the Gaza atrocities are part of that process. It's an attempt to weaken further and further the Palestinians without physically eliminating them, to the extent that they are so fragmented, isolated, and physically tired. I mean, it's a society, it's a community that has sustained, I'm not going back to 1882, but 40 odd years, almost coming to 50, of a brutal colonial occupation that weakens them on a daily basis. I mean, if a Palestinian farmer has to walk 3 hours, 4 hours to get to his olive grove that is 10 minutes away, basically, if not 5 minutes away, then this daily occurrence yields a situation in which it's a community that is simply exhausted. And the Gaza atrocity is part of it. It has had its own immediate conjunction and circumstances, but it's part of it. And what they have in mind specifically about Gaza since the so-called disengagement is what my good friend and colleague Moin Rabbani wrote in the London Review of Books recently, in the last issue, a description, an analysis of the situation there, which he called mowing the lawn. Now, this he borrowed from Israeli officials who use the term to describe what they're doing in Gaza, mowing the lawn. In other words, supposedly leaving it alone under siege, of course, but not entering and not bothering it too much. And then when they think that things got too dangerous from their perspective or too good, and a few hospitals have been built, a few schools, and so on and so forth, they mow the lawn, which is what this terrible so-called operation has been all about. I think my worry, as someone who is on the side of I'm Israeli, but I'm on the side of the Palestinians, with all my thoughts and heart and activities and so on and so forth. Is that soon there will be no Palestinian community, collective. I'm not talking about individual people actually being there, which is an achievement, don't get me wrong. It's in and of itself an achievement, and the best way to resist settler colonialism is simply to stay put. Because precisely what they want is for people not to stay put, to go away. But if their project of fragmentation and weakening which is dynamic, it's not static, continues in a decade or two, there will be no Palestinian community with any energy or vitality left to speak of. And this is a great danger, and it's dangerous because it's insidious. A big ethnic cleansing or attempt to do so, or bombardment or anything like that, is dramatic, and however biased the media is, it's immediately divulged. But this daily exhausting of a community, creating these small enclaves which cannot communicate, is something that you don't really see. It's a daily, you see if you're very interested on a daily basis like I am, but how many of us are there? Not too many. This is extremely dangerous, and I say again, if we are already awake, but a larger body than us is not woken up, will find in 10 years, in 15 years, a Palestinian community in Palestine, which is a series of enclaves which will have been exhausted of any political and social vitality. I'm sorry to end with this pessimistic note, but the danger is real. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Peter. I think it was illuminating, very disturbing, yet important for us to hear these views, and I think everyone here would agree that this is what the American public needs to hear as well, the reality of what's going on. And I think you definitely explained this particular conflict in a scholarly, critical, and objective manner. And I just want to know, how many students do you teach to at UCLA? Are they getting this message? Is it getting around on campuses? What are some of the conflicts there?
Yeah, I don't teach only, I want to, and I have to teach also the part which is Ottoman history, which is less related, but I do teach these topics. I have my detractors, of course. I've had campus watch students taking notes and so on. What can I say? Yachrab Beto.
Okay, we won't translate that. George Bashara is our next speaker. We'll get into the discussion after George's speaks. George Bashara is a professor at law at the University of California, Hastings. He's a trial lawyer for the office. He was a trial lawyer for the Office of Public Defender in San Francisco before joining the UC Hastings faculty in 1991. Professor Bashara studied law, anthropology, and Middle East studies at Harvard, and wrote a book about Palestinian lawyers working under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank. He writes frequently on law and politics in the Middle East, both for academic audiences and for major media sources in the US and abroad. Professor Bisharat is an avid fly fisher, sometimes in such exotic locations as Russia and New Zealand, and also writes articles for fly fishing magazines. So you get a little personal angle of George. He is here to present to us the case for International Criminal Courts and War Crimes Tribunal for Gaza.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Salam, very much for your introduction, for the invitation, and thank all of you for coming here. Wonderful to see you, Gabby, my good friend. I am going to say a few words of introduction before I start into the discussion of war crimes and what to do about them, how to instill accountability in a few minutes. The topic that we're talking about today, settler colonialism and war crimes, in a sense, for many of the reasons that Gabby described, go together perfectly. There's a connection in the sense that in the past, colonialism has frequently...
A little closer to you.
Maybe a little closer. Okay. Colonialism has frequently entailed, particularly settler colonialism, has entailed extreme violence on a mass scale. But there are two senses that I want to draw out in which the fit is not quite exact. First, the notion of war is not really fitting because of the frequent asymmetry of forces, especially in later colonialism. What we have witnessed and are still witnessing in the Gaza Strip today cannot really be described as a war. That implies two equal parties that engage with armies and the like, and that is simply not what we're talking about. What we're witnessing today and what we saw in past examples of settler colonialism were vastly superior military forces battering and overcoming and slaughtering indigenous peoples. The second sense in which the fit is not quite exact is that war crimes really is a kind of a 20th century phenomenon. The Hague Convention of 1907, the Geneva Conventions after World War II, 1949, the very concept of genocide was not with us before World War II. The notion of ethnic cleansing really came about as a consequence of events in the Balkans in the 1990s. So, and colonialism, however, was primarily an earlier phenomenon. And the 20th century was an era of, for the most part, decolonization. And this points out the oddity of Israel, which was founded a year after Indian independence. It is the only settler colonial project that is still advancing its external borders in the 21st century. So it is doing so in the era of the United Nations, of human rights, not to mention in more currently media, internet, smartphones, and the like. As a consequence, the tools that have been available to prior settler colonial projects, ethnic cleansing and genocide, have not been available to Israel for the most part, except intermittently in the case of ethnic cleansing in 1948 and 1967. So what we're seeing today is how settler colonialism works in a totally novel environment, constrained in some degree anyway by international organizations, by international law, and under the scrutiny of the world community. And overall, the impact is that advances must be surreptitious and or incremental. The purposes can't be admitted. Land seizures are primarily via administrative means, legal means, backed, of course, by threats of violence, but not by sweeping violence, except, as I said, intermittently. And there is periodic repression of resistance rather than cataclysmic annihilation, as Gabi pointed out and quoting Israeli leaders, mowing the lawn. And there is fragmentation of the Palestinians as a people, not, you might say, destruction not in fact, but in effect. So what we have witnessed over the last 4 to 5 weeks now in the Gaza Strip is an example of this periodic need to repress resistance. Now, what are some of the international legal violations that are arguably involved in this current onslaught against the Gaza Strip? So it is important, first of all, to refer back to the conditions that preceded this onslaught, and in particular, in respect to the Gaza Strip, the siege that Israel has imposed. It's hard to put a beginning date on it. There have been restrictions on the freedom of movement in the Gaza Strip beginning in the early 1990s, when the entire territory was fenced. The ratchet was tightened quite a lot more in 2006 when people associated with Hamas were elected to the Palestinian Legislative Council. In 2007, when there was an attempted coup against that government, against the Hamas government, that was overcome by Hamas. The screws were tightened still further. So it's hard to put a beginning date on the siege, but the siege is an act of war. It is also functions as an act of collective punishment against the people of the Gaza Strip for exercising their democratic vote, and it is in violation of Article 33 of the Geneva Convention. What about the claims of self-defense that Israel has been making with respect to its current attack, and which has been reiterated unfortunately, by our own president, repeatedly by all our political leaders? Is Israel acting in self-defense because rockets have been fired? This argument is, this right is invalid in this circumstance for two main reasons. Of course, Israel, as any other nation, has a right of self-defense. That does not mean that this is a valid exercise of that right. Israel still occupies the Gaza Strip for reasons essentially because of the siege. It is like the jailers who control a prison by controlling its perimeter. Inmates may have freedom in the yard or in their own cell, but if they can't leave, they're not free people, and that is the circumstance of the Gaza Strip. The people of the Gaza Strip, they live in the largest open-air prison in the world, and as a consequence, Israel continues to exercise what's called in international law effective control, and that means that they are still occupiers. And this doesn't mean that Israel has no rights to defend its citizens. What it does mean is that this is not an international armed conflict and should not be judged by that standard. Rather, when one country occupies the territory of another, it has police powers, and it may exercise police powers, but the use of force under a police force model may be no greater than is necessary to quell disturbances. And the massive use of sophisticated military technology against the people of the Gaza Strip far exceeds that model. More importantly, is that self-defense cannot be claimed by the party who initiates violence. And that is essentially the situation that we see here, where Israel exploited the pretext of the unfortunate, tragic murders of 3 Israeli young men as an excuse to try to do something militarily that it had been unable to do diplomatically, which was to ruin the Palestinian National Unity government. That was really the essence, that was the goal behind the crackdown on Hamas in the West Bank. And that resulted in arrests of hundreds of people, searches of thousands of residences and other structures, and the killing of 9 Palestinians. So self-defense is not validly being exercised in the circumstances. Probably the most significant form and the most evident form of war crimes violations in this current conflict involves what is called the duty of distinction. That means that a military is required under international law to attack only military targets, and it must distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and between military objects and non-combatant or civilian objects, and it is supposed to only attack the latter. Or, under very limited circumstances, it can attack civilian objects where that confers a military advantage, or if civilians actually engage in combat, they may be then attacked too, but otherwise civilians are off bounds. What we see in this conflict is that Israel has seemingly treated virtually all members of Hamas, whether they are involved in the military struggle or not, as combatants. And all Hamas facilities and objects have also been treated as if they were military targets. Let me give you an example. Taysir al-Batsh is the police chief of Gaza City. He was in his cousin's home. I believe the date was July 18th. A huge bomb was dropped on that home. It was deliberately targeted to kill him. Now, he did not die. He was wounded. 18 other members of his family were killed. He is the civilian police chief for Gaza City. He is, under international law, properly categorized as a civilian. So this is one of the clearest examples of war crimes. This is also evident, that is, the violation of the duty of distinction is evident in the many attacks on civilian objects. 170 factories, at least, have been attacked and substantially destroyed. The attack on the power plant. And there are many other such examples. Use of weapons in an indiscriminate fashion. So flechettes are little darts, metal darts, deadly, that are dispersed from a tank shell, usually. The tank fires a shell, and at a certain point the shell explodes, and these thousands of these darts go shooting out. These have been used in the Gaza Strip. Heavy artillery has been used in heavily residential areas, in heavily populated residential areas and the like. These weapons are not necessarily illegal depending on their use, but their use in these kinds of circumstances are necessarily indiscriminate and therefore illegal. You know, I'm sure, that there have been many attacks on protected places and persons. 75 mosques, 2 churches, hospitals, ambulance and rescue crews, UN, United Nations schools, and other sites. There are many other of these examples. I'm going to wrap up quickly, because I think I won't speak any more about categories of crimes. I do think we need to perhaps have a discussion about whether it is reasonable to begin talking about the crime, not just of politicide, which is a sociological concept, but the actual legal concept of genocide, and whether it is appropriate in these circumstances. I think that is a valid discussion to have at this point. But I'm going to switch at this point to talk a little bit about mechanisms of accountability. Unfortunately, as you well know, Israel has essentially enjoyed impunity from its violations of international law since its birth in 1948 to the present. Unfortunately, you probably are also aware that the United States government is one of the principal reasons for that impunity. Our government our diplomats in the United Nations have exercised the veto power on behalf of Israel more than 40 times. That is more than half of all of the exercises of veto by the United States since the founding of the institution. So the United Nations Security Council is not, unfortunately, an effective mechanism of accountability. You are perhaps aware that the Human Rights Council of the United Nations has already called for an investigation, and that is, of course, a positive step and an important development. Needless to say, their reports require political will for enforcement. And where that political will is lacking, the effects will be mitigated or minimized. There is a great deal of discussion these days about Palestinian accession to the International Criminal Court, the ICC. And the ICC came into function in 2002. 120 or so nations of the world have signed on to what's called the Rome Statute, which founded the court and which gives jurisdiction. Palestinians diplomats have made efforts in the past to invoke the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Their initial attempt following Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009 was rebuffed by the prosecutor of the ICC on the grounds that Palestine was not a state and he was not in a position to determine whether Palestine was a state or not. That issue should have been overcome by the November 2012 vote in the United Nations General Assembly granting Palestine non-member observer state status, and the new prosecutor of the ICC, she is the one who rules on jurisdictional issues, has indicated that if Palestine presents a proper application, then the ICC will accept jurisdiction. Now, there is a great deal of political pressure that can and will be exerted against any party that tries to invoke jurisdiction in this circumstance. You may have read the other day that Benjamin Netanyahu appealed to the United States government to exert as much pressure as possible to bar ICC investigation of Israeli actions in the Gaza Strip. There is also internal Palestinian political debate about the advisability of this move because of the possibility that there may also be investigations of Palestinian actors. And the argument is that the firing of indiscriminate rockets, just like the firing of indiscriminate artillery or flechettes on the Israeli side, constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity. And that is not an insubstantial consideration. Now, to my way of thinking, the advantages of ICC accession are far greater than the risks, and despite these difficulties, these challenges, it would be, it seems to me, a failing on the part of the leadership not to go forward with ICC jurisdiction. And one of the ways in which you can be helpful, particularly if you are Palestinian, is to make your voice heard to the leadership and to urge accession to the ICC. There are other very important advantages to ICC jurisdiction, which include not just the investigation of what's occurred in the Gaza Strip over the last 4 weeks, but also the consideration of what I might call systemic crimes. One of them being the whole settlement project in the West Bank. Quite clearly, the settlements constitute war crimes under the Geneva Conventions, grave war crimes, and are explicitly barred, that is, the transfer of civilians into occupied territory is explicitly barred under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Similarly, the crime of apartheid. And we are familiar with the concept of apartheid in a kind of historical, sociological sense, but there is also a legal meaning to the term apartheid. There is a crime of apartheid, and it is arguable, in fact, I think substantially arguable, that Israel's actions with respect to the Palestinian people as a whole, not just the Gaza Strip, amounts to a form of apartheid. Now, I'm going to end because we have to leave time for some questions. I do want to say that these moves, whether acceding to the ICC or there are other things that can be done, an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, for example, like was done in 2004 with the separation barrier, all of these things require political will on the part of the Palestinian side. And there is, it seems to me, we have to be frank with ourselves, dire need for internal reform and accountability on our side. That is, the leadership needs to be accountable to the Palestinian people and needs to articulate our interests as a people as a whole, and not to stand for partisan party interests or the like. This is a difficult discussion, this is a difficult process, but it's a necessary one, and the sooner we begin it, the sooner we will finish it. Thanks.
We have time just for a few questions, and then we have closing remarks by Dr. Marhatut, and also Sherna Gluck is here to give some overview of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement and where we are. So I see 3 hands up. The first is over there, Layla.
Not that you're biased or anything.
Just because you're my wife doesn't mean you're the first. But just remember that, honey.
Thank you. Thanks both to Georgia and Gabby for coming. I think it's fascinating to listen to understand the context and the realities, and at the same time try to give ourselves a sense of hope, even when it seems so hopeless. My question specifically relates to this argument of using themselves as human shields as a justification. You talked about the self-defense argument and why that doesn't apply.
Mm-hmm.
How do you approach this one from that perspective? I know in just dealing with it from a propaganda point of view, how I talk about it,
Right.
but I'm curious to know what your response is to that allegation.
Well, from a legal standpoint, now I sound very loud to myself. That's okay. Okay, all right. The use of human shield is something very deliberate. It means actually forcing a citizen, a civilian, against his or her will to be a human shield. Now, in fact, there are repeated instances of Israeli soldiers using Palestinians, including kids, as human shields, in the literal legal sense. In fact, the Israeli Supreme Court has repeatedly entertained cases alleging this and has ruled against it, and they just keep doing it anyway. There is, on the other hand, no evidence, none, that Palestinian forces have deliberately forced people to stay somewhere that they didn't want to stay. Do they fire rockets from urban areas? Of course. That's their only option. And let's just remember in the American Revolutionary War, the British thought that the Americans were dastardly, villains because they hid behind trees and shot from behind trees instead of standing in the line like a proper British soldier and mowing each other down. The superior military would always prefer to, engage, in the way that it does best, right? And a struggle for national liberation uses what means it has at its disposal. I'm sure that Hamas would be delighted to have guided missiles and to fire only at Israeli military targets. Give them tanks, give them F-16s, they'll do, I'm sure they'll perform brilliantly. That's really my answer. There is no evidence of deliberate use of civilians as shields on the Palestinian side.
Yeah, I want to add to that as a historian, not a legal scholar, obviously, which is throughout the history of anti-colonial struggles, resistance movements have hidden or were embedded in the population that supported them. Where do you want them to be? To give just, and then the most obvious example, before 48, where were the Palmach warriors hiding? In kibbutzim.
Right.
So here you have an example of being embedded in your own civilian population, because that's what resistance movements do.
And their arms caches are now being found still. There was just read an article about how many arms caches have been found in kibbutzim and other residential areas.
Okay, and we have a lot of questions, so could you keep your question to 30 seconds, please? Just state the question.
First of all, a quick yes or no. A quick yes or no. Is the United States and Israel signatory to the Rome Convention?
No.
Neither. Second question. What is your analysis of why it is so difficult for the Palestinian diaspora to unite together and raise hell?
Okay.
Good question.
The best question.
I think that that's a difficult question to answer, but I would say that they're beginning in the early Oslo years, there was a systematic effort to demobilize the Palestinian diaspora and to bring it into line behind the Oslo project. It might have been perfectly well-meaning, but the consequences have been disastrous.
I want to add to that look how long it took the Jewish community to have the confidence and the wealth to organize itself. Don't forget that until 67/73, it was basically compliant with the policies of the US, because it takes an immigrant society a long while to gain the confidence in the institutions to organize itself, to produce leaders, to produce spokespeople, and in the immediate run, I think Edward Said, although he wasn't an organizer, obviously, is a voice whose lost has not been recovered.
Yes.
What venues are available for legal action other than the ICC where we don't run into a US veto?
Well, there are the national courts of other nations that provide some possibilities, although past experience with those shows limitations, both, for example, in the UK, where once an arrest warrant issued for an Israeli general, who therefore chose not to get off the airplane and flew back home, and also in Belgium. Both those countries suffered a lot of pressure from the United States, and in both cases, amendments to the laws were made to make sure that those I didn't mention in the Belgian case, it was the prosecution of Ariel Sharon and others for the Sabra and Shatila massacres. Both those cases, those individual countries suffered a lot of political pressure from the United States, and both relented. There is the International Court of Justice, which can entertain. One of the ways that a case can get before the ICJ is via the General Assembly of the United Nations, which, of course, is not subject to the veto, and in which Palestine generally has pretty strong support. That's how the Wall case in 2004 got there. It was referred to the International Court of Justice. The only shortcoming there is that those cases are, the GA, the General Assembly, can only seek an advisory opinion. So it's not binding on the parties. It's good, but not what we would really want.
Last question.
Thank you, gentlemen. I have 2 points. About the ICC, does the ICC have jurisdiction over Israel since it hasn't signed the Rome Treaty? And the second point, assuming there is jurisdiction, is there a legal way that the United States can stop it other than political pressure?
No and no. In other words, no, Israel is not a signatory, therefore jurisdiction cannot be effected through Israel itself. In fact, the reason why I think there is so much interest and discussion about the ICC is precisely because there is no institutional or legal means. It's insulated from the United States. The United States is not a signatory. Even if it were, that wouldn't give it the power to negate jurisdiction where the prosecutor found it appropriate. So I think it's precisely because of its relative insulation that it is attractive. But it will be, believe me, it will be subject to a lot of political pressure, and the Palestinians, of course, themselves will be subject to a lot of pressure. The first thing that will happen overnight is that Congress will convene, and 535 votes will guarantee that no more funding for the Palestinian Authority, which my own view is that would be a blessing. That would be a blessing, because that aid has been like a drug, and it has. Well, I'll just leave it at that.
Right. So we don't have time for any more questions. We have to go to closing remarks and then an announcement on behalf of the BDS movement. But just let me say, people talk about a Palestinian voice. People talk about there are no legal options that are available, or there's still some obstacles to the legal options. It comes back to raising awareness of the American public and changing public opinion on this issue so that the government is forced to deal with it. They cannot deny these issues anymore. And that's why we're having this teach-in. It is up to us to begin the conversations on these issues and to create our own narrative the way it's been eloquently explained to us. We now have the responsibility to create that voice for justice for the Palestinians. And that's why we're here today. So just remember the policy and the legal aspects never change until the people force a change. And that's why we're here.
Yeah.
With that, I'd like to have Dr. Merha to give some remarks. And he obviously has been working on this issue for decades and told me he will make the time to be here with us. We really appreciate having him, and I'm sure we'll enjoy his words of wisdom on this issue as well.
Thank you very much, Salam, particularly for the wisdom part. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'd like to welcome and salute our two guests for sharing their knowledge, their expertise, and for showing their courage, which is a rare commodity in America these days. So thank you very much. We said repeatedly that the Palestinian issue is not Palestinian. It's not an Arab issue. It is not a Muslim issue. It is a humanity issue. It will judge our stance vis-a-vis that issue, will judge how far or close we are to be real, true human beings. So it is crucial. It is a very exposing litmus test. There is no escape vis-a-vis that issue. Either you are human, which comes with its suffering and agonizing and feeling hope and feeling despair, like all human beings, or you are subhuman, so enjoy it. And it is not telling about Israel. Israel already told about itself. Israel chose the final solution to deal with the Palestinians in the two forms that were eloquently expressed, either by reducing the Palestinians to domestic animals in cages, or just finish them off. That's what Netanyahu government chose to do. And they are doing it actively and under the nose of the so-called, erroneously, the civilized world. It's not telling much about the Palestinians. They are the victims, and victims are victims. There is no story behind that to tell. They have the honor and the glory of being resisting against all the odds. But their role in that quagmire, they are proudly the victims. It's not telling much about the United States, because the United States declared its true colors, and our government, our elected tax-collecting government, decided to work against American interests, against American leadership, and against American ideals, shamelessly and with no apologies. headed in that direction by President Obama. There is no room to mince words here. The government of this country betrayed this country. As simple as that. And they sold the American model and the American dream for seats in the Congress or on the cabinet or in the White House. To the point that the Congress of the United States exceeds the Knesset in supporting Israel.
Yes.
Which is probably the first model in history of such a thing.
Stop that.
So the Congress is an occupied territory, but not against their will. It is an occupied territory because they decided to surrender for personal gains. And that explains where the Congress stands. It is telling much about us, about what we'd like to call the remaining extinct, endangered species of honest people, honest human beings in this world. This is regardless to the race, nationality, or religion. People are either people or subhumans. And that is the danger of that litmus test. It is not a conscience crisis because it is not so mysterious. It is the metaphor I give, like you are on the sides of the street and comes a man and kills a child in the middle of the street. You have two options. Option number one, which is the majority is taking, to go and analyze the situation, but the child threw a rock at him, or to look at the history of that child. Let us study his circumstances of his ancestors. Let us go back to Balfour. Let us go back to before Balfour. Let us go back to the Canaanites and Malachites in the Bible. And keep going back, but the child is killed, and you did nothing about that. This is not an issue where you try to find who is right and who is wrong. This is an issue that is so outrageous that the crime should not go without being accounted for. And this is why, because it is telling so much about us, is the other option for you who saw that is to seek ways that will not cause more damage to change the situation. And we chose the legal route to change the situation. There are so many courts in life, the court of conscience, and that's lost, the court of public opinion, and that's hijacked by the megaphones of propaganda, and we have the courts of law. And this is a form of non-violent resistance, together with other effective ways like divestment, boycotting, protesting, etc. I am not denying the validity of any one of those. Of course, some of them are more effective, like divesting, but, and to me, some of them are not effective, like demonstration in front of the White House. I go to the den of the thieves as Jesus said, to complain that things are being stolen, that's really itself is not making any sense. So we are trying to seek our way, being laity as we are, but laity with, hopefully with conscience and with faith and with belief in goodness, to find ways to seek legal ways, alternatives to what is already shut off, like Le Hay or whatever there are. This is why we are honored by inviting those two professors to shed some light on the dark corners so that we can find our way around in love of peace, in love of justice, and in love of humanity. May God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Mansour. Before you leave, we have two things for you to do. The first, I wanted to introduce Sharon Gluck. She is leading the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Committee here. And first of all, congratulations. Starbucks has announced they do not support Israel. They want your business. Okay, well,
Their CEO does.
well, he came out with a statement, so let's talk about the problems later. Let's say that at least he felt pressured enough to issue that statement. Okay. With that, Sharon Gluck.
Assalamu alaikum. And George, I will absolutely understand if you have to get up and leave.
Well, I have to take him to the airport, so I can't leave. He can't leave without me.
I want to thank Salam for inviting me here again. I want to open by following up on some of Gabby's closing remarks about politicon, because it relates to what BDS means for the Palestinians inside. For the first time in 20 years, I went back to Palestine in late March of this year. And what struck me the most was the fragmentation. Not just the political fragmentation, the social fragmentation was absolutely astounding in comparison to 20 years ago, and in comparison to the days of the First Intifada, which helped forge some unity amongst the Palestinians inside. And I also want to pick up on George's comment about apartheid, because one of the things that we can do in the BDS movement, we can't as citizens do anything about sanctions. And we know that our government, our president, our Congress, our state legislature will not impose sanctions on Israel, even though California legislature not just imposed sanctions during the South African apartheid struggle, but they also, with pressure from Zionists, really, imposed sanctions on Iran and Sudan. But we will never get them to do that when it comes to Palestine. However, as citizens, we can engage in boycott and divestment. Divestment means going to pension funds, for instance, and pressuring them to divest from corporations that are complicit in the violations of Palestinian rights and international law. For those of us who are in public pension funds, like PERS, like LACERA, some of you may be members of LACERA, the County Employees Retirement System. And if you are, I hope you'll come up and talk to me when we finish. And I can talk to you a little bit more about that campaign. What we can all engage in, however, is the boycott movement. Now there's what I call the self-Zionist boycott, which is the boycott only of settlement products. That does not deal with the core issue. And what most of the people who are engaged in that form of boycott, it's great. I'd love for them, they should keep doing it. But what they argue with us is, well, that's the settlements and that's Israel, as if somehow there's no connection. We can't boycott Caterpillar. How much of us by caterpillars. We can't boycott El Beat, which the drones that were flying over Gaza during this most recent genocide, those are produced by El Beat. They also are flying over our city in terms of surveillance. They're also flying over the border. But there is a company like Hewlett-Packard that we can boycott. And not just boycott, but educate people about the ongoing Nakba. Educate people about apartheid in particular. Educate people about both the occupation and the apartheid throughout Palestine. Hewlett-Packard issues all the IDs for all people in historic Palestine. The Israelis, citizens, both the Palestinian and Jewish Israeli citizens, may have the same blue color IDs, and since 2005, they no longer say if you're Jewish or Christian or Druze or Bedouin or Palestinian. There are asterisk marks there now. However, embedded in the information are clear indications of who the Palestinian citizens of Israel are. There's also the ID cards for those in the occupied territory who they have orange cards, or if they're not allowed anywhere at all, they have green cards. This is complicit with apartheid. Hewlett-Packard is helping to facilitate apartheid.
Yes.
It is a perfect target for us. And any of us, any part of Los Angeles, could join in this, not by signing pledges, yes, but by going to retail outlets in groups, standing outside those outlets with literature, with banners, informing people. There is also, let me just quickly say, I have a dumb phone, most of you probably have smartphones. There is now an app that enables you something called boycott.com. One of the campaigns is Let Palestine Live. So if you go anywhere and scan a product, it will show up the corporations and the kinds of things they're engaged in. Hewlett-Packard, by the way, is part of that. There are a bunch of corporations that are doing it. So I urge you to join us. We're launching this HP BDS campaign. If you're interested, please come up and talk to me. I'll give you information. We're meeting next Saturday. It's really critical that we help to turn the tide the way the BDS campaigns are doing elsewhere in the world. Thank you.
There are petitions for you to sign, if you haven't signed, did sign on Friday. The mayor and 6 members of the city council came in support of Israel.
Right.
And they had to listen to some sirens from Tel Aviv without acknowledging any of the suffering of the Palestinians. So we have a petition for you to sign that we'll send to the mayor's office, basically protesting that he came out one-sided, and unfortunately we had higher hopes for this mayor. You know, I'm really sorry that we run out of time. I got to take George to the airport. I don't want him to miss his flight. But again, let's thank our speakers. Thank all of you for being with us. This really was just the beginning. We're going to talk more about how we can be more effective in our actions. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.